Hi, I'm Cynthia Hoven. Welcome to the lecture series on anthroposophical topics, the four elements. If you enjoy these lectures and would like to hear more or learn eurythmy from my online eurythmic series, visit eurythmyonline.com, and thank you for donating.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final lecture of this series, The Elements, the Four Kingdoms of Nature, and how they work in the natural world and how they work in us. This evening, we're going to continue our studies with a deeper step, talk about the four elements, the four ethers, elemental beings, and how they work in the plant and how they work in the natural world. This is a huge study. And once again, I've spent the week working on it, pulling all of this material together, and I find it terrifically exciting. I have myself, although many of you know me as a eurythmist, that is, as an artist and a therapist, I also have a degree in mathematics and physics. And for me, it was always interesting to see how the natural scientific view can be metamorphosed and actually come to life through the spiritual scientific work of Rudolf Steiner. And so I love to get into some of these books, these research books that I have, and read them in great depth. I'll show you one of them. This is the one that I spent lots of time today reading. And this is a compilation of everything that Rudolf Steiner said about the world ethers, elementary beings, and the kingdoms of nature. But it's all in German, so you probably can't get it. And you can see how old and well used it is. But that's very important for pulling together these pictures of how the ethers have been involved in making the world, making living substances, and making the elemental beings. So that's the world we're going to go into tonight. As we begin, let's do once again a little movement imagination just to get ourselves back into things. We did this a couple of weeks ago, and I said, let's just imagine with your hands. I'm a very tactile learner, somatic learner, but imagine the beginning of all time. What was that original essential warmth like? The whole universe, just warmth with no planets inside it yet, nothing material at all, even less than material, no air, no light even, but this warmth, the central warmth of being. And then this being gradually contracted a little bit and became what we now call air. And then that contracted more than the next big phase of evolution and became warmth. And then it became what we have on the earth, solid. And our existence has this as a background in time and a background in substance. And so let's release from here, because we live in these substances and ethers all the time, back to water, this viscosity flowing, air, which is weightless and expansive, and fire, essential warmth. From fire to air, to water, to earth, and earth, to water, to air, to fire. And out of this, then, let me recite the poem that we've been using for our lessons. I was born of the shining of distant stars. I drew their beams with me from afar. I was born of the gold of the radiant sun, of the light of the world, ere the earth begun. Born I was of the silver eye, of the guardian moon keeping watch on high. born of the flame's intensity, born of the wild winds roaming free, born of the waves that lap the shore and the rock that hides the glittering ore. Born I was from out of the whole. I bear the world within my soul. And yes, we live in all of these. We live in the rocks, the waters, the air, and the fire. We live in these all around us. And we also live in them inside our beings. So before we go on to work with concepts and all that they do to our heads, take a moment, please, to tune into your essential nature, which is fiery, which is warmth, that core in the light of your being, which you know to be guiding your biography. And then feel how this essential you lives inside the microcosm of your body. And feel in that. Feel yourself living in the air element and breathe. How the oxygen comes in and brings life-giving air to your body. And then feel how you have the waters that shape and form your body, also let you move. They're very essential in your muscles. And then feel with gratitude the bones which give you your scaffolding. And feel yourself, it's this fire inside of that. And I would like to remind us all that we have access to this fiery self inside the body at all times. And as we live in 2021, when life is just going at such a crazy pace, our essential nature is the one that's living inside the temple of the body, growing, observing, learning, doing, creating your destiny in this time. So with gratitude, let's go. Let's dive into this next study for this evening. I want to begin by remembering that all creation happens through beings, great spiritual beings. And I'll quote Rudolf Steiner here for us. He says, essentially, in the entire universe, there is nothing other than consciousness. This means that the true realities of the world are beings, all in their varied individual conditions of consciousness. Yes, all forms of the spirit, which Rudolf Steiner talks about, all of these, earth, air, water, fire, and plants and fungi and all of that. These are expressions of the beings of the spiritual hierarchies. And these beings exist far above the level of the earthly element. And so let's remember what we have here. We've done this a couple of times, so I don't need to linger with it quite so long this week. But I included on our chart this week the ethers, which we went into last week. We have here these four cosmic stages. And in each of them, so ancient Saturn, the A again is for ancient sun, ancient moon, and earth. And again, ancient Saturn is the beginning of time. So vastly long ago, that we're looking into eternity. Anything beyond that is infinity, eternity. And the earth, if there was a big bang, it would have happened here, so that long ago. So way back there, When time started, it started with the expression of the Creator pouring forth world warmth. And this warmth created the warmth ether. And warmth is, listen carefully to these words, warmth is such a powerful element of being that we can say warmth is both element and ether, or it stands at the doorway between spirit and matter. You can hardly differentiate. You essentially can't differentiate between the etheric nature and the warmth, the etheric nature of warmth and the elemental nature of warmth. That's what's happening when we make the effort inwardly to feel the inner fire of our being. We're right there at that threshold to a pure spiritual experience beyond that which is mediated by the body. After ancient Saturn went through all its development with the spiritual beings, and let me just write, the greatest spiritual beings who were involved in that we call the thrones. Perhaps half of those of you who are listening are familiar with that, and perhaps not, I don't know. Then there happened a second stage, also taking incredibly long, that began with a warmth ether. And then part of that warmth ether became denser. And in becoming denser, it gave rise to cosmic air. Customarily, we say it gave rise to the element of air, but it's more correct to say world air or universal air or cosmic air. It's not identical with the kind of air that we have here. This air has been solidified to be married with substantiality. That's what we're going to look at tonight a bit. And simultaneously, the ether that belongs to the air, light was created. Light as the bearer of wisdom. And this time in evolution was midwifed or created even by the Curiosities, the spiritual beings of wisdom. And we've talked about that in other webinars. There's a lot more to say about that. I'll leave it at that for right now. And then on ancient moon, the creative beings were the dynamis. Again, we've been through this. The warmth ether was unified. But out of the warmth ether, there continued this process of densification. And this densification caused too many colors, right? Caused the densification into cosmic air and the sublimation into the light ether. I'll just go ahead and put that over here now because I've got the pen off. And a further sol process into cosmic water and a further sublimation into chemical ether. Remember, we spoke only ever so briefly last time about what the chemical ether is. It's also called the tone ether. It is the structuring, ordering, harmonic relationships between things. You can see that, you can really understand that well if you've ever done those experiments with the Chladni plates, where you can see the effects that sound has on matter. You know, if you take this really fine, I forget what it's called, but it's like sand, only finer than sand, put it on a glass plate and run a violin bow across the end of it. The sand separates into these rings corresponding to the tone of the note that was played upon it. So these forces live in the chemical ether, and they're actually all around us, part of the ordering and structuring of the very world that we live in right now. These chemical ether forces, tone ethers. Maybe you can see by that why they're called both chemical and tone, because their harmonies cause the harmonies that are reflected in natural science as the laws of chemistry, biochemistry, and the whole elemental table of elements. And then we have with the earth evolution, something new. Instead of calling it cosmic water, air, warmth, we're going to call it the water element. So first, not until we get to the earth stage where we're going to have material, do the elements appear as elements, but they are still connected with the ethers. And anything that is alive has to be in relationship to the ethers. Otherwise, it's dead. So the elements are around us in everything that is manifest on the, in this dimension, certainly on the material plane. But not everything is alive. And to be alive, it has to have an etheric body in it. Remember, this is not a mechanical process. In everything, there are spiritual beings involved. But I'm going to turn this over now, take the next step. And for this next step, I'm going to be looking at a little bit more into substantiality. And I'm going to be drawing from the material in Rudolf Steiner's agriculture lectures, where it gets another dimension of exciting, where he says, like this, spirit is everywhere. On ancient Saturn and Sun and Moon, of course, it was there. Spirit is also everywhere on our Earth. But in order to ground itself, to be present on the Earth, it needs an anchor. Otherwise, it would just, so to speak, fly around. So then Rudolf Steiner, in talking about how farmers can work with the well-being of their land, he draws this as an example of the scaffolding of carbon, something in the world like the form of the plant. But he said the form of the plant would never happen, could not exist, if it weren't everywhere permeated by life. So obviously this relates to you and me, as well as to the plants, and to the animals too, of course. And he says then, turning to us, for instance, he says, that can only be brought in by oxygen. So we have here this wonderful thing that oxygen is now suddenly, O2, oxygen, is defined as the carrier of life. Of course, if you have only studied physical chemistry, you just know, how many electrons it has and so on, how it works. But here we take another step and say, what does it really look like as a spiritual being? So to go back to the one I didn't cover yet, the black is we could call it the scaffolding, the form. And the form is carbon. Carbon, it's very interesting. Rudolf Steiner tells us it's both the densest, but it's also really the most spiritual of all of the elements, because it actually is connected to that original Saturn warmth. It's come all the way down through creation. The earth element is extraordinarily sophisticated. But again, in order to be enlivened, it needs to make itself open the spirit. And now Rudolf Steiner introduces what might be a somewhat surprising concept, looking for another color. He says, spirit needs to have some sulfur all the time, which, as we all know, is a fiery thing. We have it in our matches that has to carry the oxygen into the carbon. I won't go too much further in that, but to the farmers, he says it's always present. So when we inhale, we're bringing in the life. Now, Rudolf Steiner says something so interesting there, that the oxygen in our bodies is alive, but the oxygen outside of us is not alive. He said, if we were in a room full of living oxygen, we would perish or pass out, essentially. It would overwhelm us. But when it comes inside of us, it has to get linked up with our inner structure and be able to enliven our carbon and get involved in the living metabolic processes inside of us. It says it can't do it alone. For this, it also needs another element. And this is what else is really present in the air. At least some of you know that right away. Nitrogen. And of course, he was talking to the farmers, but he said, the oxygen gets carried to all the places in the body where it's needed by the presence, by the working of the nitrogen. The nitrogen says, here, come here, oxygen. This carbon needs to be enlivened. Come and get these bones over here. And these muscles, they're working really hard. Come on in, come on, and make this body alive. So that's what these elements are doing in the plants. I should give you one more then. He says after the body becomes enlivened, then at some point, the spirit that has been chained into matter will also need to release back to source. You can imagine, just think we can't have all the spirit just here. There has to be a breathing between periphery and center, periphery, cosmic and earthly all the time. And so what can I call that? Release is given to us by, any guesses? What element would we like to see up here? Some of you will know right away. That's hydrogen. Hydrogen, which is the very finest of all of the elements. It has the very lowest atomic weight, only one electron. And surprisingly, Rudolf Steiner says, because it has so little matter in it, it's actually the least spiritual of all of the elements. That's kind of surprising. So we have here the basic structures of life, the protein and the carbohydrate molecules in our body, but also in the plant. He says he tells the farmers then exactly how this works in the plant, and we're going to get to that very soon. But how the different parts of the plants build up their leaves and their flowers and sublimate. And then how the plant material goes back into the earth. And he also speaks at that point that the oxygen in the air becomes enlivened when it goes into the earth. So we should imagine the surface of the earth full of life. So these concepts came at you hard and fast right now, but try to think to yourself. First of all, when you learned chemistry, you probably didn't have any sense of these elements as living beings. We are taught to memorize their qualities. But Rudolf Steiner speaks about them as different. So this is the carrier of sensitivity. And he says where nitrogen penetrates into the soil, in its curiosity and its sensitivity, it spreads out to the soil and it enables the plants to feel their environment and go into the places where they need to have nourishment. That corresponds, of course, to what we now see in science as a mycelium. But the question is which is cause and which is effect. And we could say the mycelium is showing up there where the nitrogen as a spiritual process is doing its work, and so on. So if we understand that there's a science that's actually looking at the processes behind nature, perhaps we can feel invited to explore how we can open the door to seeing the livingness of nature. We'll go a step further with that in just a moment when we get into the elemental beings. So, but let's stick with this for a moment, because we human beings have, well, first of all of these carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen are pointing to the four kingdoms of nature. They're pointing to the physical, the rocks and the minerals. They're pointing to the etheric. So the oxygen is the carrier of the etheric in the world, the carrier of life. They're pointing to the astral, the carrier of sensitivity, that which enables us to feel and enables the plants to feel, enables animals to feel, and to the ego nature, the I am, the spirit core. And again, as we looked at already in the first week, this is the earth element. This corresponds to both ethers and elements. The physical body corresponds to the earth element, and in the nature around us, it corresponds to the rocks and the minerals. Wherever the physical is combined with the etheric, we have the plant world. Where the etheric is present alone, we have freed etheric forces which can just fly away from the earth. They're not active. But where the etheric is bound into things, we have living creatures, living beings. And some beings have their own individualized etheric body. Where we have the astral, so the word astral means something that comes from the stars. No, I'll have to stop myself from going any further on that one. But it has to do with sensitivity, what we can feel. And where the astral forces are freed, not tied into matter, they're living in the expanse of the air. But where a creature has an individualized or an internalized astral body, we have sensitivity. And that's, we're looking most clearly when we examine the animals and the humans on that. And of course, hydrogen, so ephemeral, so light, you can hardly see it, but it is the bearer of the spirit self-consciousness of a human being. And the animals don't have that essence of fire in them that the human does. So I want to, as I promised, linger for a moment on our human etheric body, as I promised. And I want to talk for a moment about, so the human etheric. We have an individualized etheric body. Back up a second. Each of us has our own physical body, etheric, astral, and ego. We were born out of a purely spiritual dimension, and then we came in to these elements in such a way that by being born into the elements, we could, at all the appropriate places, have an etheric body there and an astral body. So that was a very, very careful process of our embryological development, that our ego could unite with the body and very carefully be woven into the four elements in the right way, specific for a human being. Not only generally specific, but also personally specific, so that the astral body that you have is completely created out of your own spiritual forces, so that it carries your destiny from all your previous lifetimes forward. Your etheric body is also specifically created for you. Little caveat here. To begin with, the etheric body is woven very much out of what it inherits from the parents, but we transform it as soon as we're born into the body. But because it's such one of the lower elements, one of the lower aspects of us, a lot of that power is inherited. Nonetheless, your etheric body is really individualized, and also your physical body, initially strongly determined by what you've inherited, but in time, through your work of your ego being born into your body, it becomes individualized for your own personal development. So your own etheric body, and this is the point I wanted to make, I want to talk about the temperaments, the four temperaments. Many of you have heard of them, and this would be the appropriate place to talk about them. Your etheric body will have certain proclivities, certain attractions, certain flavors, certain tendencies according to what you need. And these tendencies in general can be aligned to one of the four different ether types. So you might have an etheric body more connected. I'm going to change my sentence. I mean ether types, but it's easier to say closer to one of the elements. That's the language we generally use. You could have an etheric body that is more closely aligned to the earth element. It's still etheric, but it has a quality, I'm sorry, I'm talking and writing, has a quality of an earth. Can't write a long word while I'm talking. Has a quality of earthliness, of being slow and not so flexible, in contrast to the etheric body, which carries more of the watery element in it. As a quality, it has an affinity, a natural affinity. And that would be this kind of feeling in the life. The life process is a general aura of that person. And that's a person who would tend to be slower and harmonious and takes their time, loves to eat, works over things in some depth. That's your melancholic type. And then some people have an etheric body that's much more closely related to the air. And that personality type is called a sanguine. And the sanguine type, to understand them, we must understand all that we're saying about the air. Connected to light, the ether of light, is expansive, wants to move, doesn't want to be chained down, wants to always be in action. Your sanguine personality is the type that gets hard to pin down on any topic, on any subject, on any work, on any project. Teachers know that they're the ones who are always chattering in class and excited about everything, easier than some to be diverted and led into a project or something. The sanguines are changeable. And then the choleric has an etheric body that's more closely related to this ego, the fire. And the cholerics are the ones who are so ready to stamp their feet and if necessary to fight. And they're not necessarily negative. They're not ready to fight belligerently. They're just ready to take on a project and do something. They're vigorous on the earth. They want to take hold of things. It's like the ego in them has come plunging in. Whereas for the melancholic, and we're fond of saying the melancholic just thinks that everything goes wrong just for them. It's just everything's a problem for them. So they don't have this innate, inborn possibility of changing and engaging the ego, or of giving up, or moving on to the next thing, like the sanguine, or just enduring, like the phlegmatic. It's interesting to remember that it is especially in the ages 0 to 7 when the understanding, when the power of the ethers is the strongest in a human being. Later on, a more dominant quality in the human being are the qualities of the astral body. And those are the planetary types. It's a whole nother study. But teachers, actually up to grade age 14, I should say, teachers in the Waldorf schools, especially who know about this, are always quite aware of the temperament type of the children that are sitting in front of them, and are always trying to use the understanding of the temperaments to adapt the lessons to suit the particular needs of that temperament. And yet, if I were to say to someone else, what temperament are you? And the question's not entirely wrong, but it has all shifted when we become 21, after age 21, when the ego should be overseeing how we use our astral body, how we use our etheric body and our physical body. And we shouldn't be so automatically compelled by our temperament. In fact, when we get older, we should be able to personally use all of the temperaments in the way that and all of them, we should be flexible and moving between one and the other according to situations. All right, let's go further. And now we're going to step into the world, the huge world of the elemental beings. But we have to take a couple steps to get started, of course. So remember, at every step of world becoming, beings are involved. And now let's go back to the time that was the beginning of the earth, possibly the Big Bang, that's one construct around it, but we would understand that as the time when the earth was surrounded by a living ether. I say that quite consciously, a living ether that was going to become the home ground for everything that's manifest now. And the world ether is not a mechanical thing. It can be described as a very complex, multifaceted world. The universe of cosmic beings are holding this living ether as its periphery, as it's like the cooks around the kitchen, if you will. And these beings have the lofty task of being active in the creation of all that has appeared on the earth in the realms of nature. all of these beings. As I said, the thrones, the karyotes, the ones I mentioned in the beginning, the dynamis, the exousiae, and then also, as we'll see in a moment, also the beings that are closest to us. And I know that many of you are familiar with these words and many of you aren't. So just need to let that, I have to be aware of that. But the archai, the archangels, and the angels, beings that are much closer to us. So at the beginning of the earth, we imagine them surrounding the ball of what will become this earth being, huge. That also includes the sun and other planets in it, the sheath of the life ether. And then they have sent into this great cosmic creative ball differentiated forces of the life ether. So the differentiated forces of it to provide what would later be needed for the 4 different ether types. The earth ether type, the life ether, the tone ether, the light ether, and the fire ether. These are all involved in constructing the elements that appear in the earth. And thereby, for instance, with the chemical ether, they were able to send in the etheric forces that would shape and create these chemical or these toning forces of the different bodies. With the light ether, it was used to separate things out. So light is very sculptural and divisive in its actions upon things. It's like a sharp knife in that. So we see these phenomenon all around us. In doing so, these cosmic beings created what are called the elemental beings, and these are the highest elemental beings. And at this point, we can say that there are different levels of elemental beings. The highest elemental beings are really free and still freely able to wander through the living ethers of the world. They move as general cosmic beings. But later, they're going to give rise to more specific elemental beings. And in this way, these higher elemental beings are helpers of the cosmic hierarchical creating beings. They're ready to aid them. And these highest beings have the task of making a sacrifice of themselves by making their own etheric substance available to create the ether bodies of all the living beings on the earth. Many, many, many elementals are needed for this. And Rudolf Steiner speaks of this. There's a word in German that he employs for this, which I can't translate with one word into English. It's called Abschnürung. He says that the elemental beings are Abschnürungen of the element of the creative hierarchical beings. So to create an Abschnürung, perhaps we can imagine a balloon. And if you've seen a balloon artist at the park who's making, dachshunds out of a long balloon, they're going to twist a part of the balloon, and one part of the balloon is kind of broken off from the general balloon body. And if we could take that little broken off part, it's born out of that big balloon, but it becomes, for a while, somewhat independent. And that's as close as we can get to creating a concept for what their bodies look like. The different elemental beings were created out of the hierarchical beings, They are responsive to their intentions. They are in harmony with their will. They do what the higher being wants, but they in and of themselves don't have any independent consciousness. Their consciousness is involved with the hierarchy that made them. And they're completely obedient in that. So again, there are the cosmic hierarchical beings. And then when a being needs to have an etheric body, they enter into that. But then there also comes a time when the earth became so hard that beings needed to have physical bodies. And it is the elemental beings, and here's an important sentence here, it is the elemental beings who, as Abschnürungen, have allowed themselves to be enchanted into matter to make the bodies that we wear. Many, 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 many beings have been enchanted to serve the bodies that we wear, to be enchanted into the forms of the rocks, the mountains, the trees, the plants, animals. Nothing is just a material process in this matter of creation. But if and when all of the etheric body is removed, is disappeared, is freed, leaves a physical thing, then it dies. So we'll go a little further now, and it's best and fun to begin with the elemental beings in the plant kingdom. So there we're immediately led to a whole host of beings which were known in previous times and recognized by instinctive clairvoyance, but now they've been almost forgotten. Because our eyes are used to seeing only the material aspect of things, or names used by the poets, but the modern human being thinks of them as superstition, but they can still be perceived by those who know how to work and live with the plants. They flit all around the plants. So let me flip the chart here. And here is a plant, rather primitively, totally out of context. Of course, that's a little painful. A plant should have its entire environment around it, a very schematic plant. And we begin with a consideration of the roots and the gnomes. The gnomes are the so I'll quote Rudolf Steiner a lot on this. And Michelle, maybe you can write in the text if you like we did last week. Most of the best descriptions of these beings by Rudolf Steiner are given in the book, Man as Symphony of the Creative Word. And I think it was William Tell on our chat here, who also knew another name for that book in a more recent publication. I think it has another name. But in that book, there's so many descriptions of the elemental beings. And there he says, the gnomes are...
Would you say the title one more time?
Man as Symphony of the Creative Word.
Got it.
So,
thank you.
The creative world word, all these beings that spoke the world into existence. And the human being is a symphonic resonance of all of these creative beings. Oh, fabulous title. So Rudolf Steiner says these are quite special earth folk, especially involved in the root. He says no root could develop if it were not what is mediated between the root and the earth realm by these remarkable root spirits, which bring the mineral element of the earth into flux in order to connect it to the roots of the plants, to the underlying, and here we're talking of the spiritual process of taking up living substance. He says the in describing their nature, he says the gnomes are entirely sense. They're entirely sense. They're not thinking beings or feeling, but they're entirely sense in their spiritual nature. He says apart from that, they are nothing at all. They consist only of sense, but at the same time, that sense is intellect. That means what they sense, they immediately understand. And they can be in relationship to that. I'll go on a second. In their process, they perceive how the plant needs to grow. So to stick with how the gnomes work in the plant realm, he says the world, the full plant is fertilized by the insects, and seeds are created in the plant. And then at the end of a growing season, the plant falls away. The seed falls down to the earth. But as the plant is falling away, there trickles down into the earth the light from the flowers, the heat of the sun, the formative forces from the stars. And these then are cosmic intelligence, everything that has come here, all these formative forces. They trickle down to the gnomes, and the gnomes understand that plant. And the gnomes, he says, are able to wander throughout the earth. They find no resistance in the rocks underground, and the ores, the veins of ores on underground are, if you will, roads or passages for them. And they carry with them what that has trickled down to them from the plants. They carry, and he says, I love this sentence, they carry the ideas of the whole universe as they stream and wander through the earth. And then when a new seed is sprouting, they bring the corresponding intelligence of that plant to that seed. Essentially, that's behind what we then explain nowadays through the genetic creation, through the genetic processes. And then when the plant begins to emerge from the earth, it leaves the realm of the gnomes, and it enters the realm of the spirits known as the Undines, or water spirits. I wrote that here, Undines. And the Undines are close to the soil. They're watery beings. They enjoy being in the plants. They cannot open themselves outwards like the gnomes do as sense beings. They can only yield themselves up to the movements of the whole cosmos in the element of air and of water, where they meet together, where they touch. They don't have the clarity of mind of the gnomes. They're really dreamlike, and their dream is their own form. Now, to imagine beyond looking at the plant, another place we can see the activity of the gnomes is in a river, where you can observe the water swirling on its way down, making little eddies, and then unwinding and winding and threading. My river does that beautifully all the time. I go to my river every day and look at the water forms there, watching the metamorphosis of form and understanding more and more how the Undines are showing how forms are bound and released. And the Undines take those forms and release them into the leaves. And through that, the plants are lifted out of the earth. Otherwise, the plants would wilt. We could call them the world chemists. And they have a very delicate spirituality as they work with the chemical ether and the tone ether, creating these shapes. They are so happy when they're always metamorphosing. So The next level of the plants are the sylphs, and these are the air elemental beings. That's their home. And they live and they exalt in the light, in the atmosphere. And the best place to see the activity of the sylphs is by looking at the birds, and especially in the murmuration of a flock of birds. And if you've ever seen them, if you've probably seen pictures on YouTube of photographs of whole flocks of birds that spiral up and come down again. Hundreds and hundreds of birds together that look like one being, that move apart and come together. That's possibly the etheric body of one great sylph flying with them through the air. You could also say they append themselves to a flock of swallows or a flock of geese. They belong to the coherence of flocks of birds. And deeper, Rudolf Steiner says that they listen to the air currents. They hear the currents of the air. They hear it as music. Can you imagine? Imagine that. When the wind blows, or even deeper, the currents that happen when the birds are soaring through the air, when they find an updraft, that would be a musical experience. And the sylphs absorb that. And their consciousness is more asleep even than that of the Undines. They dream. That means they're very, very, very peripheral, whereas the gnomes are point. Yeah. So we've built up these concepts over a while, the peripheral nature of the air. And if you imagine yourself expanding into that, you wouldn't be aware of much. They have their own sense of self by seeing the motion of the birds. And one of the places where Rudolf Steiner talks about them, he says they carry cosmic love through the atmosphere. In the plant, their task is to convey light to the plant. And it works on this chemical process that was created by the sylphs. And he says, by bringing this light into the plant, they're responsible for creating the ideal plant form in this specific plant. Finally, we have the fire spirits, which are sometimes called the salamanders. And they live, first of all, where the plant becomes really very, very refined in the stamens and the pistils, where it turns into pollen and flies into the air. That's the place of the finest aspects of the plant, where it almost becomes non-physical. And to really understand a plant, we may say that the insects that are around the plant, eating from it, nurturing it, bringing pollen to it, carrying the pollen away, the bees and the butterflies and others, these are the fire nature of the plant. And the fire spirits are really involved in the so-called conversation or the interaction of these elements, of these insects with the plant. So no longer materially connected to the plant, but out in the air. And Rudolf Steiner says the salamanders take the warmth of the atmosphere and convey it, carry it into the flowers. Where else do we see them? We see them not only in the interface between the insects and the flowers, we also see them everywhere at the lively interface between matter and spirit. In the natural world, they can be found there where human beings interact with their animals. The shepherd with their sheep, the rider and their horse, me with my dog, the beekeeper and their hives. Everywhere where that interaction is happening. So yes, you and your dog or you and your cat, you've got a salamander warming up that relationship with you. They delight in following the tracks of the insects so they can convey this warmth to the carpel. They feel connected to the butterflies too. And they promote the outstreaming of spiritualized matter into the cosmos, seeing that the essence of the fire goes out into the cosmos, and then also blessing it so that it goes into the interior of the earth. So I think I still have time to talk about a few more qualities of these. Rudolf Steiner goes on to talk about the gnomes and says, they laugh at us. They just can't understand why human beings are so stupid, because they have the immediate understanding of everything. They think we're so dumb. They say, why do you have to think? It should be so obvious what different things mean. Let me move this away a little bit now. They can be ironical. And actually, he said they don't like the earth. They have antipathy for it. They would love to get away from the earth. It threatens to trap them, but also the earth is not a hindrance for them. They're always pushing against it. And pushing against it. And in that way, they're also kind of pushing the plants up. He said they have an unconquerable lust for independence. They're not community beings. They always carry the solid element, the element of solidity, from one stage of the earth to the next. They're the preservers in the evolution of the continuity of solid structure. And he says, there's one line that he says, that if the gnomes would like to say anything to the human being, they say, strive to awaken. Wake up. Notice what should be obvious to everyone about the spiritual nature of the earth. The Undines, the water beings, don't hate the earth. They enjoy this process of living in the water and swimming and floating in them. They also enjoy becoming phosphorescent. So if you've ever seen the phosphorescence in the sea, that's an activity in which they're very active. They would actually love to pass out of existence, though, even though they don't hate the earth, but they would love to go back to the spiritual world from which they come. They have a longing for death. The sylphs also long to die. They want to give themselves up. They want to go beyond the boundaries of space. And the fire spirits, they find bliss in knowing that they are being seen by a higher hierarchies. Yeah. So when the plant makes a seed, as the composite of this whole journey through the elements, it goes back into the earth. And there Rudolf Steiner tells the farmers something very beautiful, that the real fertilization for a plant does not happen when the pollen, the stamens and the pistils come together, but rather when the seed is laid in the earth, because the earth is the female element for the plant. The plant, in a perspective, is a masculine element. And when she receives when the earth receives the masculine element, it's like the Mother Earth has received the process that fertilizes. Now, at this point, we should realize that not all elemental beings are these plant elementals. There are also many other elementals in the world. Of course, there are elementals in rocks, in mountains. There are elementals in landscapes, and perhaps some of you are perceptive enough that you can feel the energy is a vague word that I think we use far too often, but we can feel as if there's a beingness in different like places in the forest or different rooms we walk into. There are elemental beings of spaces, of places. There are also elements of time, of seasons, and so on. That study would take us far afield, and I can't do all of that. I wanted to restrict the consideration to the elementals that live in the plants. But we also have these malevolent beings, and many of them are caused by us not interacting properly with the good elemental beings. And so here I would very much like to speak about how the elemental world is actually longing for us to be in relationship to it. I want to read something that Rudolf Steiner wrote about this. It's very beautiful. He says, the moment a spiritual reality becomes physical, elemental beings must be banished into this physicality in order to create visible reality. If we observe a plant in the usual way, we do not in the least sense the presence of an elemental being in it normally. Normally, we do not dream that every plant harbors something which is not satisfied by having us just look at it and form an abstract mental picture, as we commonly do with plants nowadays. For in every plant there is concealed, under a spell as it were, an elemental spiritual being. And really, only the person is observing a plant in the right way when they realize that this loveliness of the plant is a sheath of a spiritual being who is enchanted in it. A relatively insignificant being, to be sure, in the great scale of cosmic interrelationship, but still a being intimately related to human beings. And when we see the lily in the field, growing from the seed to the blossom, we must vividly imagine, although not personified, that this lily is awaiting something. Again, says Rudolf Steiner, I must use human words as I did before to express things. These words cannot quite cover the meaning, but they do express what I'm trying to say. While unfolding its leaves, and especially its blossom, this lily is really expecting something. It says to itself, people will pass by and they'll look at me. And, when a sufficient number of human eyes will have directed their gaze upon me, so speaks the spirit of the lily, then I shall be disenchanted of my spell, and I shall be able to start on my way into the spiritual worlds. All around us are these elemental beings begging us, in effect, do not look at the flowers so abstractly, nor form such abstract mental pictures of them. Let rather your heart and your soul enter into what lives as soul and spirit in the flowers. For it is imploring you to break the spell. Human existence, and this sentence is the final sentence, but very important. Human existence should really be a perpetual releasing of the elemental beings, the elemental spirits, lying enchanted in minerals, plants, and animals. Take that the next step. It's true, probably, that most of us can't see these beings vividly, And Rudolf Steiner also says elsewhere, that's fine. We don't need to actually have a picture image of them. It would be a sad thing, he goes on to say, if we had to rely on that. But indeed, if we had to rely on everyone being able to have this super sensible capacity, but if we are able to walk through nature with gratitude and a living desire to perceive the beingness of nature, then through our humanness, we're connecting the world of nature back to spirit. We're like a conduit. We're a link in that chain of beingness, of becoming matter and ascending back into spirit. And then, right at this point, Rudolf Steiner says, when we don't do that, these elemental beings cannot necessarily get back to the spiritual world on their own, and then they become prey to dark forces. And there indeed, he speaks of Lucifer and Ahriman, and some of you know these names, some of you don't, but these are malevolent beings who don't mean well for the human being. And they're eager to take these elemental beings, and they will turn them into forces that prey in many places in the world, in our bodies, for instance. And in one place, Rudolf Steiner says they turn into parasites. In another place, he says they turn into viruses. But he says they can cause other kinds of mischiefs as well, dark mischief. So they can cause bad dreams. They're demonic beings, some of them. And some of them prey on our addictions. Some of them can get right inside of a human being who's not in charge of their own astral forces and disturb that too. And I want to take just one more look at another phenomenon that's increasingly happening in our time, and what is happening when we create so many machines. And in all of the machines that we're designing, we are enchanting elemental beings, building them. And everything we make, we're pulling these enchanted elemental beings into them, whether that's a chair or a car or a computer. But when we start asking these machines to carry the capacity of intelligence, we are taking them away from their original relationship to the spiritual hierarchies and linking them into the world of automated electricity driven by automated intelligence, driven by, supported by, carried by electricity, magnetism. And this is the realm that we, people of the present age, are living into. And as we begin to see what's called augmented reality in the future, in which a whole world of illusion will be presented by virtual reality as if it's real, we have to be quite aware that our birthright is born out of these high spiritual beings. And we need to stay attentive to how important it is to be grounded in the actual divine manifestations on the earth, real physical matter, real etheric substance, real astral qualities. And we must know the machine world, the artificial intelligence, the virtual reality for what it is, a man-made virtual world in which elemental beings have been trapped. And that's, for me, that's a painful thought, but I also acknowledge that we're going there, and I take some comfort in knowing that Rudolf Steiner said, there's no point in running away from that. It will come. It's going to come. We have to live in this world, but we have to do it consciously. And to do that, he said, for every step that we take into the subnatural world, we have to rise at least equally high into the spiritual world and develop ever more our capacity for supersensible perception. And so with this, let's steel our inner resolve to always remember to look at this miraculous, beautiful world of the elements and the ethers created by these spiritual beings, gifted to us with their Abschnürungen and all. Let's make a real inner resolve to learn to see these things, this God-created world for what it is, and understand the world of subnature for what it is. Some of you know my husband was a magnificent biodynamic gardener, is a magnificent gardener, although he doesn't have his original garden anymore. And he always said he couldn't directly see the elemental beings, but he understood their workings in his garden. And one of the things that he always did was practice gratitude toward the plants. And so when he would have a whole bed of crops of carrots or lettuce, whenever he would have a bed of new crops, he would never just start harvesting them, and he wouldn't allow his apprentices to harvest them without going through a gratitude practice. And he would ask all of the apprentices to stand with him in front of the carrots that hadn't been opened yet, harvested yet. And he said, let's observe these plants. Let's really look at them. See how they're growing. Observe their life processes. Give thanks to them. And then when we harvest them, we'll be in right relationship. So, dear friends, we're going towards Thanksgiving. And so as we close, I'd like to say a Thanksgiving gift for you, a prayer for you as a gift. For the dark earth that cradles the seed, and for the rain that brings forth the green leaves, and for the stars that give form to the flowers, for the warm sun that ripens the fruit, for all this goodness and beauty, Heavenly Father, Father, Mother, God, we thank thee. With that, we close this series, and let's see if we have time for a few questions. Thank you.
Oh my. Okay. A question just came in from Marcella. And she asks, is the current crisis of carbon a spiritual crisis? Where does dark matter lie? Is dark matter spiritual? Is our climate crisis a crisis of the elemental beings? Are the elemental beings conscious of environmental degradation? Are these malevolent beings created by humans?
The current carbon crisis, do you mean, which part of the carbon crisis do you mean by that? As for the question of dark matter, I don't have an answer to that one yet. I think that's a very intriguing question, but that one's, I can't presume to answer that. I don't understand what it is yet. Is our climate crisis a crisis of the elemental beings? By all means, they are suffering what we're going through. And we can see that the earth is losing its capacity for fertility everywhere. One who looks at gardens, who looks at food, can see that the plants aren't as vital as they used to be. They don't have the shelf life that they used to be. Forests that are, for instance, planted with monoculture, They have no natural vitality anymore. Some people say that the elemental beings are running away to the North Pole or maybe the South Pole in the South. They're escaping what we're doing to them. And many of them, since they're the mediators between the spiritual world and the earth, I think when the elemental beings can't be active in nature anymore, we will see a further weakening of nature. So yes, and of course the elemental beings are conscious of that. And finally, you ask, are the malevolent beings created by humans? They're not created by humans in their original source, but actually, I think some malevolent beings are the so-called Abschnurungen, also of the Ahrimanic beings. They're just as the higher beings, angels and so on, have their own Abschnurungen. But some of the good elemental beings are hijacked by the malevolent spirits, Lucifer and Ahriman, and forced to do service to the dark forces.
Thank you. Okay, our next question comes from Shirley. And Shirley said, in a previous lecture, you mentioned fire works into air and will create light. When fire works into water, it creates cosmic harmony. But does fire working into earth create cosmic harmony as well?
No. So,
what?
Yeah. I'm here, right? Is everything okay?
Everything's fine.
Okay. So the fire working into the air created the light ether. The fire, the warmth working into water creates the chemical ether or the tone ether, the cosmic harmony. The warmth working into the earth element creates what is called the life ether. So the earth, I've said before, is the condition of matter that is the most dead. It's actually a condition where spirit cannot penetrate of its own. And the exact complement to that, the opposite, the equalizer to that, is the so-called life ether. It's also called the word ether, the logos ether, the highest ether of all.
Thank you. Okay, Shirley also mentioned in a previous lecture, you mentioned about we humans have to be fully grounded or properly grounded during our time on Earth to be awakened. The question is how to be fully grounded. Are there anthroposophical ways to be properly grounded?
Oh, what a great question. Yes, absolutely. First of all, don't live in a world of illusions. Be present to what's going on. Do your work, feel your feet, take care of your body, follow through on your intentions. That's being grounded. To be into the physical body, of course, it's fabulous to do gardening or any other physical labor. And when I teach eurythmy, I'm always teaching in a way that grounds you. I will say some people do eurythmy and just let it make them really light because eurythmy works with the ether forces, but I'm always working a way to use eurythmy to harmonize right into the legs and right into threefold walking and into the feet. But yes, just being fully awake to our present time. And once again, not living in illusions. I, as an anthroposophist, I don't advocate meditation forms in which you visualize your own best dream and go into a world of cosmic oneness. No, not that. There are more formative forms of meditation that we work with in anthroposophy and so on. Great question. I love it. Thank you for asking.
Yes. Now, Shirley also asked, you have briefly mentioned about Brian Gray's class. which class was it in Wise Cosmos?
Oh my goodness. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the whole series of classes that Brian did for them. I can't answer that.
I'm reading. Okay. Shirley asked, does Earth have an ancient Earth?
No, I mean, this is ancient Earth, is ancient Moon, is ancient Sun, is ancient Saturn. It just means that that the actual time of ancient Moon happened before us, but the Earth is all of these. And now this is present Earth. When we get to the next cycle of evolution, which will be called future Jupiter, and I give you this lecture, then I will write ancient Earth, but not yet.
Oh, one of the many reasons I love you. Okay. Marcella came back and said, going back to her first question, she said global warming.
The global warming as far as the carbon crisis.
Yes.
And the question was, is it a spiritual crisis?
Yes.
Well, I don't think there's any other way than to say absolutely it's a spiritual crisis. What we're suffering is what we did. And that's a spiritual crisis. And it's affecting every aspect of this divine sacred earth that we live on. Every aspect. As a spiritual seeker, I'm completely aware of the spiritual crisis that we're in. We're not doing justice to this divine earth created out of the sacrifice of all these beings. So absolutely. It's a spiritual crisis on a cosmic level. I don't underestimate its magnitude at all. These are serious times we're living in.
Yes. William asked, what does our gratitude for these beings cause in the beings?
First of all, they feel recognized, right? It helps them to be able at the appropriate time to be disenchanted. Once again, Rudolf Steiner uses the word that they have been enchanted into matter. And they don't have a way, that's sort of equivalent to dying into matter for them. And they really want to undie, to be disenchanted. And that does that. In the meantime, though, through our gratitude and right relationship to them, they really make a better garden. And of course, Harold, by doing the biodynamic preparations, gives them the nourishment, and the BD preps give them the nourishment to help them. They're kind of like food for them. And they make an awesome salad for us. Harold's vegetables and biodynamic vegetables are beyond compare.
Let's see. Oh, William asked, is the warmth of salamanders, in quotation marks, the same as physical warmth?
Well, now they live in the element of warmth, right? That's not their own warmth, but they live in the quality of warmth, which is everywhere, more or less warmth. So, and as I said, this warmth is it's the same as it's spiritual and it's physical, both at the same time. If it wasn't here, we would be absolutely frozen out of existence. So yeah, the atmospheric warmth is what they are dealing with, which is caused by spiritual presence of being.
Yes. Okay. Judy asked, if the elementals are released through our love for them, are we then without the blessings that they give us?
Perhaps it helps to remember how many there are, like more than a gazillion of them. There's just an infinitude of beings to make up my body, your body, there's so many beings that let's keep this chain going of movement between enchanting and releasing and enchanting and releasing through living a practice of gratitude. No, we're not without their blessing. No.
Judy reframed her question and said, if they are disenchanted, do they leave us?
Yes, just like an animal spirit will. They will. But there will be others there. But when the plant wilts, then those particular elemental beings that belong to that plant will go away. And I think if they've been properly thanked, they'll go back into the spiritual world. And if they haven't been properly thanked, some of them will become hostage.
Mm. And then Tish recommended a wonderful book, The Spiritual Hierarchies and the Physical World. She says, is a good reference book regarding the elemental beings.
Thank you, Tish.
Yes. Okay.
All right. So,
well,
dear friends, yeah, Michelle?
Speaking of gratitude, I just want to extend our gratitude to everyone who has supported this lecture series with their donations. And I just want to say thank you ever so much for making this possible.
I couldn't do it without you. Really, this is how it works. So thank you for participating in the elemental beings who are involved in energy exchange through money. How's that sound? I will, in December, I'm going to do another eurythmy webinar to take us through through the Advent season, getting ready for Christmas. And then sometime in the new year, I'll start another lecture series. Right now, I don't think I'll do a lecture series in December. I'm still working towards doing a lecture series on life after death in our relationship to the planets and the constellations and life into reincarnation. And I'm also going to do something finally on inner work based on knowledge of higher worlds. And I truly recommend that you try to join the eurythmy classes, because that's where I think Anthroposophy comes alive. So, thank you very much. And Lisa has one more question.
Yes, Lisa said, if they have been properly thanked, do they go when we die or when they die?
Oh, Lisa, my goodness. I have also read somewhere that they go when we die, but I've also heard that they go in their own time, like when the plant dies. So I leave that one open for further research. Thank you for bringing that question. Yes, but when we die, there's a lot of elemental beings that are dissolved along with all the other things that happen when we die, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Cynthia.
Thank you, Michelle, for being the most wonderful co-host and support person life could have given me.
Well, thank you.
All right. Good night to you all.
Good night.